Claire asked a question about the reality of abstractions. Note that there's a podcast request topic on my forum where you can post stuff if you want to. So to begin answering the question, we need to talk about what abstractions are. A dog is an abstraction because the laws of physics don't say anything about dogs. The laws of physics deal with subatomic particles, or maybe something else, maybe fields or strings or whatever, but definitely not dogs. So I'll just assume it's subatomic particles. So a dog is made out of many subatomic particles, but physics has nothing to say directly or specifically about dogs. They are an emergent property, an abstraction. So you take all those subatomic particles and you group them together into concepts called atoms. Not all subatomic particles are in atoms, but a lot of them are. And so the atom is a useful concept. It's a useful way to think about and look at and understand these subatomic particles. And it helps reduce the number of things we have to worry about. It takes multiple things and turns them into one single concept. But there's way too many atoms to think about, so we made the concept of molecules, which are groupings of atoms. And then we made the concept cell, which is a type of grouping of molecules. And you could have multiple layers in between molecules and cells if you wanted to. There is flexibility on how you group things and how many steps you skip, and so on. And you can build up from cells to organs, and you can get to dogs, which contain cells and some other stuff. So are dogs real? Do dogs exist? Yes, of course. So a lot of the questions about abstractions and the reality of abstractions depends on your goal or what exactly you mean by real or exist or abstraction. So people don't normally think of a dog as an abstraction. They think an abstraction means something like beauty or love or maybe math. Something that doesn't have a physical existence. They think a dog has a physical existence. But one of the meanings of abstraction and considering them real and like a junk concept is rejecting reductionism, thinking that there are things other than subatomic particles and the basic laws of motion. So I'm not a reductionist. Layers of abstraction come up in other fields as well, such as software. I am a software developer, so I'm familiar with that. People build up from low-level functions, code, libraries, etc., to higher-level stuff that builds on top of the lower-level stuff. The concept of an abstraction in software is that the higher level doesn't need to know the implementation details of the lower level. It can just understand the concept, the high-level summary of the stuff it's building on, and otherwise treat it as a black box. And so the lower level could be rewritten with new code that uses different variables and different math and whatever. And as long as it has the same function, the same conclusion, the same purpose, then the high-level code should still work. So it's not dependent on the specifics or details of the things underneath it. And we see the same thing with dogs. If I'm wrong about subatomic particles and it's actually strings or fields or something, that's not actually going to change my understanding of dogs. My view of dogs doesn't depend on the specifics of how atoms or molecules work. It may depend on some specifics about cells or organs or something. If we had to rethink what organs are, then I might be a bit confused about dogs and have to rethink things. But there is some level of abstraction where the details below that don't really matter to my view of dogs. They might matter if they changed enough. If we completely had to rethink physics, then it's an all bets are off situation. But most potential changes to physics that seem plausible or like realistic things that might happen are not actually going to affect my view of dogs. In software, when the layers are connected together so that a change to a lower level actually does affect the higher level, even though it still has the same function and it's just the internal details change, and that screws something up. That is called a leaky abstraction. The the details are leaking out of the abstraction, out of the black box to affect another layer, which is bad. It's also called tight coupling, whereas what we actually want is called decoupling, where things have some independence or autonomy, or loose coupling, where they only depend on each other according to a well-defined API and not the internal details. In other words, you don't want your code to directly read some variable from some other library and depend on it, and then if they rewrite their code using different variables, your code breaks. You want to only interface with the interfaces that they actually intentionally expose and are meant to be used. So I think a lot of the philosophical questions about abstractions are from people who do not know the things I've said so far, who do not see it that way. And I think what I've described so far is not a standard layman's view. So it's not just philosophical experts who see it differently, but our culture in general doesn't think of abstractions in that way. And the ways they do think about abstractions are a bit confused. So it's hard to give really clear answers because I think our culture just doesn't fully know what it's talking about on this issue. And the same goes for a lot of the philosophers. They often seem a bit confused to me. So whether beauty or love is real depends on what you mean by real or existing or whatever. Which I've had that kind of discussion with people sometimes, but I've generally found it not very productive or useful. And it's often hard to tell what the point is, what the goal is. Like, why do you want to categorize it as real or unreal, existing or non-existing? What difference is that going to make to anything? Love is an emotion. Understanding the concept helps you understand people's behavior and predict them better. It helps you understand yourself better. You could look at brain states and what is physically going on with the electrical activity in brains, and you could connect some of that to love, similar to how we could connect atoms to dogs. Another example is God. Is God real? Well, in the direct, straightforward sense, I would say no, he does not physically exist. But the concept of God exists. People think about God, it affects their life. There's something there that exists and can be understood. It plays a role in people's lives. There's a thing that exists that you could call God, but it's different than God being like a physical thing that lives in the sky and maybe even has a beard. That sort of God doesn't exist. So if you define your terms and exactly what you're asking better, it gets a lot easier to answer. Because a lot of these things have a duality where they don't exist in some sense or way, but they do exist in some other sense or way. Tangentially, there's some interesting questions about God. Does belief in God make one's life better or worse? And if it makes one's life better, then is it good to believe in God, even if he's a myth? Because it makes your life better. So, going back to Fire's original questions, he asks about Deutsch's view. So, Deutsch says that we should think things are real when they are involved in our best explanation. So, we see some group of atoms, and we say, oh, that is a dog fetching a tennis ball, and it's running. So, we're using concepts like dog, fetch, tennis ball, and running. And because those are our best explanation of what's going on, we should think that dog, tennis ball, etc. are real. The reductionist explanation, in terms of only atoms or subatomic particles, is not the best way to understand what is going on with that group of atoms. Fire also brings up Ayn Rand, who brings up 4 schools of thought. So they're the Platonists, who say abstractions exist as real entities in another dimension. So I do not agree with that. Neither does she. The moderate realists, who think abstractions exist in reality in the form of metaphysical essences. So don't agree with that either. Nominalists think our ideas are only images of concretes. Abstractions are names we give to arbitrary groupings on the basis of vague resemblances. So don't agree with that either. I think they are non-arbitrary groupings on the basis of good explanations or something like that. And then the conceptualists, who think abstractions have no actual basis in reality, but think that concepts exist in our minds as some sort of ideas, not as images. So that's better. They are ideas, not images. but they do have a basis in reality. Rand says abstractions as such do not exist, only concretes exist. But she says we use concretes when we are creating a conceptual hierarchy or layers of abstractions, as I would call it. Anyway, I think she's saying that the word dog, which we either visualize or hear in our head, is a concrete thing that exists in reality. It has a physical existence. So that's close enough, but it seems a little bit confused or confusing. It's easier to talk about this stuff with people who know software, not just so that they understand layers of abstraction in software, but also knowing something about computers being physical objects. So all of our thoughts and ideas are, in fact, things that physically exist in physical reality. There's no, like, other realm. I'm not a dualist. Computation and thinking are part of physical reality. They follow the laws of physics. They follow the laws of motion of physical objects called computers, and our brain is one of those. So that makes abstractions real in the sense that they're in our brains, which are physical objects. They're just data in a computer, so it's similar to saying that data in a hard drive is real. So that is one of the ways that they're real. Overall, I think this is one of those areas where people ask big, broad, difficult philosophical questions that aren't well defined enough, and then have not very productive debates about them without a clear purpose. What difference do different answers to the question actually make to any activities or projects you're going to do? What thinking processes about decisions in your life are going to reach a different answer based on what you think about the reality of abstractions? I'm not saying it's all meaningless or useless or anything, but a lot of the discussion is. So I'm more interested in understanding what a dog is, how it's a grouping of other things, etc., than what terminology we use to discuss it. The dictionary, notably, is just wrong, I think, as a factual matter. So this is New Oxford Dictionary. It says abstract means existing in thought or as an idea, but not having a physical or concrete existence. But ideas do have a physical existence, the same as data on a hard drive. Or possibly data in RAM is a better comparison. You can turn hard drives off and then turn them back on again and get all the data. If you turn a human off and then try to turn it back on again, or just do data recovery, you will get some of the data, but you will lose some. Whereas RAM loses data when turned off. I don't know the details very well, but basically there's constantly some electricity holding data in RAM. And whenever you shut it down, all the data goes away. So our brains are partly like that. But anyways, RAM clearly physically exists, and the data in it physically exists.